Hello everyone, and welcome to another episode of the All Words Are Free podcast. So this week, considering it's a lead up to Christmas, I wanted to keep it lighter, although I do always find the darkest recesses of every single topic that I decide to talk about. But today, I wanted to do another book club episode because I thought I really enjoyed the last one, and I've been listening to, again, audiobooks. I'm still into those. I've been listening to Butter by Asako Yuzuki, which is Waterstones Book of the Year. And I have many opinions. The first thing I want to kind of start on, leaping straight into it, the fact of audiobooks themselves. I think the reader can definitely make a difference. Like, whoever's reading it, I think the person who's reading it on the Spotify one, that's just the version that I'm listening to, kind of changes her voice between the different characters. And I found that quite nice. I like the kind of differentiation. But I have found that when she does the voice of Kaji, the character I'll go into later, she sounds so insipid and arrogant and annoying. And I think it's for a purpose, which I'll get onto. But she does it well, I think, considering like what the characters are and what their motives are, as I have read it or indeed listened to it, how I've perceived. But yeah, so we're going to get into this novel, what I think of it, and then also use it as a little springboard to have a quick discussion about books of the year and prize titles and what this means for the future of a novel and an author, and then also looking into the whole serial killer public or serial killer journalist relationship. So before I delve into the themes and my thoughts, I'm going to give a synopsis. So this is provided by the RCW Literary Agency. The Butter by Asako Yuzuki follows journalist Ika through her investigation of convicted serial killer Manako Kaji, notorious for luring in wealthy men to pay for expensive cooking classes, only to murder them and find another. Kaji refuses to cooperate with the press until Dika, at the suggestion of her kitchen-savvy friend Diko, writes Kaji a letter asking for her recipe for beef stew, or, as she continues to say throughout the novel, beef bourguignon, and I swear to God, like, I'll get into it, but it annoyed me so much every single time because whoever's reading the audiobook, she's put on such a voice, like a posh voice, when she says beef bourguignon in the voice of Kaji, the murderess, as I'll probably refer to her as throughout this, and genuinely, it kills me. So I found it so viscerally annoying. Anyway, the ensuing correspondence and series of meetings is closer to a masterclass in cooking than journalistic research. Ain't that the truth? Dika, the only woman in a Tokyo office, works late and subsists on convenience store fare. At home, she rarely cooks more than a cup of ramen. Initially, she uses these gastronomical dialogues to explore Kaji as a subject, but soon her role takes on aspects of method acting, as Dika transforms physically into something similar to Kaji, gaining weight and tapping into stores of confidence and strength, and this is also what I'm going to get into, especially the weight idea. So the novel focuses on relationships between women and also the female experience. And it does this quite cleverly, I think, and there's some very poignant bits, especially on the female experience side of things, and referring to weight and how one looks. But to continue, the book pervades with gourmet imagery, but the delectable descriptions often tinge with criminality, taboo, or foreignness, and this is true. There is a lot of food imagery throughout this novel, and I think it does very much pervade the novel, this discussion of food and thoughts on food and kind of the worth of food as well. And while I do think there is a cleverness to this in the way that the discussion of food is used to talk about body image and the feminine experience of female gender roles, and it's very cleverly used, and Kaji, throughout the novel, and there will be spoilers in this podcast episode, but Kaji kind of uses food as a vehicle to be quite misogynistic. She's very, throughout it's revealed more and more what a misogynist she is, really. She's very typical gender roles and wants or thinks that's the best for all women. And it's the way to get forward is caring for a man, and she doesn't really see Dika's ambition to be a writer at her firm as a worthy pursuit, and instead manipulates her really, truly and fully, and it both leads to a growth in confidence, but also leads to a lot of suffering. So I made notes as I was listening to it, and I'm just going to go through these in order because it very much reflects how I feel about the novel as a whole. In the beginning, I was very anti-Butter. I didn't really like it at all. And I found it very abrasive. But I think as it went on, it grew. And I think I think it's like track 6 on the Spotify. I'm not sure what that correlates to, maybe chapter 5. I started to warm into it a bit more, and it got into Dika's character, it got into the situations, it got into the case more of, Manako Kaji and the killing of the men, and it kind of got into that more in the meditation on the female experience, whereas in the beginning it was very, very food, and Kaji is very elitist in how she talks about food, and very arrogant, very particular. To preface this initial discussion, I'm going to be talking a lot about body image, about relationships with food, about eating disorders, and I think this is really important to reflect on, especially when listening to this novel. I found it very not hard to listen to, but I found myself flinching almost when, you know, you're listening to it and it's right in your ears, and the language, and I found the phrasing of certain things very intense. And, you know, part of that is the fact of it being just translation. You know, I don't think you can necessarily speak on a novel that's been translated for its language as directly as you can for reading a novel in its original language. I think that, you know, there's different layers to this conversation. There's the topic at hand, and then there's a topic at hand, and then there is the words that you read or listen to. And, you know, you never know that if I could read Japanese, I don't know that if I'd read that I would have had a different perception. But my first note in my notes app on my phone that I got out as I was reading, so I was like, I have ideas, and this initial idea basically triggered my desire to actually do an episode on this in the first place. But I wrote down, and I quote, "Triggering as hell, but an interesting meditation on femininity and domesticity," which I think is true, and I think is probably my overarching opinion on it, really, overall, is that it is really interesting in how it discusses the female experience, and obviously I think it's reflective of worldwide as well. I don't think it's necessarily confined to Japan, which I think is interesting in itself. You know, it's a pervasive image of what women should be and do. But also, on the more food side, it was very intense, and it felt like you were being lectured in a way. And I think that was the point. I think, you know, Kaji is supposed to be this suffocating presence, and I think the novel did well in making the reader feel like Dika in the way that you did feel lectured by Kaji. And she's such an insipid character. And to begin with, I think I really struggled through those first chapters because I disliked her that much, and I found it very slightly difficult to listen to. Yeah, I've written here, this woman pees me off. It's so arty-farty. She's very arrogant and dramatic, and it's very true. She's very dramatic. Oh God, she's so dramatic, and it makes you want to slap her. It really does. I think one of the things I disbelieved in a way was how Dika, and I guess because she was insecure and going into that environment, it made sense that she wanted the story. And so I see that. And she's very clever in the way that she kind of turns it back on Kaji in the end. But, I mean, honestly, if I was the journalist and I was sitting there, I think, like, God, I hate you so much. Now she got pulled in by her. But again, that's an insecurity thing, right? You know, you can't necessarily reflect your own. And also it's a novel, it's fiction, right? So you can't necessarily look at it in that way, but I don't know. She's a raging misogynist. And so that angered me, but I didn't find that difficult to listen to. I did find the whole, you know, there was a lot of numbers and you know, talk of calories, and you should eat this but not eat this because this is better for your body and that's poisonous, and this very kind of supremacist elitist language around food. And so I found that I found it a bit difficult. But I think that obviously that's from my own personal experiences, but I think it would be worth having some form of trigger warning attached to the book, because there was nothing that I saw in the blurb or anything. Discussion of food is obviously going to occur in a book like this, and it's very much said that on the, you know, all the discussions I've heard of it, on the blurb, in the reviews, whatever, it's talking about this kind of love language for food. But I'd argue that it isn't necessarily as much a love language as a... Food is used in the frame of somebody murdering someone, and while it's talked about bringing people together, it's also talked about with great sadness. And so I think it's an interesting meditation on what food means to us, and you know, it's more than just nourishment. And I think that was done quite well, but I also think that there was a lot of demonization, and that for people who've had experiences such as myself, it's very difficult to listen to and also get past. And especially Dika is subject to body shaming, people telling her that she's fat and she needs to lose weight and all these things, and it's used to talk about how we talk about women's bodies, but especially in those first few chapters, it's not switched over on its head until right at the end, and even then there's still comments on her body. And while she comes to accept herself, it's very, in the beginning it's just very claustrophobic, it's very one particular way, and it's relentless, and you don't get out of that until later on, to the point where talk on her body and food is more than the case, and the case is barely even touched on until later on. And I think if the discussion of food just overtakes everything else to the point where it's almost like a cookbook, and you know, Kaji's recipes are talked about, saying how brilliant they are. While they may be, you're celebrating a killer who's used those foods to kill, or as a vehicle to kill. And so it's just very convoluted. And from that surface level perspective, I just think that there should at least be a warning on it, because it was very triggering and quite intense. So as a slight side note, I don't like the word butter. So obviously listening to it to begin with, I was like flinching every 2 seconds. I don't know why, but I don't know whether it's the sound or especially having it in my ears, but I can't describe it, but the word butter has such a particular sound to it that it always kind of sent a chill through me. I didn't like the word butter at all, which is obviously not great for this novel, considering they talk about it all the time. But anyway, that's a slight side note. But also, I found some of the sentences, so just talking about the actual word craft of it, quite laboured and repetitive. So using butter as an example, they might use the word butter at the end of 2 sentences in a row, which I find a bit repetitive, but not in a technique way, just in a redundant way. But obviously some of this might be the translation, so you can't necessarily put that down to the author or the craft of the novel. But another kind of potential translation thing is there's a bit of talk on evolution, and now I'm reading this back, I can't quite remember the context behind it. But the idea of like magazines being pushed out by the digital age, and the idea of like, from what I remember over time, particular original news outlets are being losing money, and people are losing work because everything is digital nowadays, and how it's a natural succession of things that are better and brighter and better for the public and whatever. And it's very on the nose. Like the way in which it's described, it's like a dictionary recitation of headline issues. There are a lot of topics picked out, I think particularly in the beginning and the middle. Topics are being plucked out to get an audience, or to be like foghorn phrases for reviewers to use, or things for people to talk about. And I did feel slightly that the novel is trying to cover hundreds of themes, but in one space and in very blunt ways. Overall, I found the novel really too long. I think there was a lot that could have been cut and was unnecessary. It was just going over the same territory, body image issues, fair enough, obviously, important thing to talk about, but it's laboured on and it's talked about a lot, and it feels like it doesn't move on. And I get that, maybe it's that body image issues are a perpetual thing and forever with you, and that makes sense that, as I mentioned before, if the goal is to make the reader feel like Dika, then having it constantly there, that does make sense. And raising it in multiple situations with different people, that also makes sense. But I felt that there was almost double the amount of scenes for saying a particular thing. So body image issues is the example. If there were like 4 scenes talking about body image issues, and there wasn't, there was more like 40. But 4 scenes talking about body image issues, it could have been done in 2, just as effectively. I just found it too long, and then there was too much. And the actual crime and the criminal stuff and Kaji's trial and everything, it all comes right at the end. And I wanted that sooner. There's a bit where, so it all leads up to a point, and then Decor, there's a bit from her perspective, so this is Dika's friend, and there's a bit from her perspective where she goes to the flat of one of the men that Kaji cooked for, and she didn't kill him, obviously, because he's still there, but she has this idea that he may have been involved in the actual crimes themselves, and it's all a layer of the crime. And then you also get Decor's meditation on her, herself, her own character, her growth or her struggles. So, as a brief overview, her relationship with her partner has become quite cold. She's had issues with becoming pregnant. So that's all layers to the story, which again is very interesting. I think that's a good meditation on the role of a woman and the idea that you should become a mother, etc. And I think that I found that the novel really picked up about then, which was quite late. And I think I always like to finish something, especially the audiobooks, I find it quite easy to listen to, and especially since I wanted to do a review of it. I wanted to carry on, give it a bit of time. And I found that it really picked up from then, because it actually got stuck into the case. And I found as the novel went on, it got stuck into the case more and more. And then suddenly it wouldn't talk about the case for ages. And I'm thinking, I just wanted to get more focus on the case, to talk about that. And it's always seen as a backdrop. And again, the food talk takes over, the kind of elitist discussion of meals and meal prep and whatever. And I also found, Kaji, again, I don't think you're supposed to like her. So it makes sense that it gets frustrating when she's talking about food and you're thinking, well, not everyone can do that. Not everyone has the time. Not all women just stay at home. Not everyone. And she was very, very annoying. It got to the point where I didn't want Dika to go back to the detention centre because Kaji was just so annoying. I didn't want to hear from her again. And yeah, I found that, sometimes the woman stuff, to put it that way, the feminist stuff, or the role of women and the discussion of that, it was a little on the nose, along the lines of being a woman in the kitchen and all that jazz, and it was just a bit, subtlety, please, I found it a bit frustrating. But on that line, so Dika cooks for a partner, and this is after Kaji sort of says, you should cook for your man, blah, 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 and it's the first time she's ever cooked for him. And it's interesting because Dika, she's very much, she would be the first woman to write at the paper, and that'd be amazing. But then she cooks for a partner because I basically, she's been manipulated by Kaji, and she thinks, because she's very insecure, or maybe she knows how, maybe she's right, maybe if I cook for him, treat him like a woman should, then our relationship will blossom. And her boyfriend says, I don't need you to act all domestic. So he's appreciative, but in that way saying, I don't need you to act all domestic, it demeans that position even further of the woman in the home. But it's thing, because it's like whenever a woman cooks, it's always fulfilling a stereotype. It's not just enjoying it. So whenever Dika cooks or enjoys food or anything, it's not her just enjoying it for what it is or enjoying cooking or anything. It's all from the perspective of she's fulfilling her role. And this is one of the gripes of being a woman, basically. To be honest, it's one of the gripes of being anyone. If you do something that fulfills a stereotype of your particular gender or orientation or race, then you are seen as reinforcing the stereotype or conforming to the stereotype. You can't just do what you want. It's all wrapped up in conformity. It's a trap of traits linked to stereotypes for, in this case, your gender. And some of the praise for this novel has been that it's very feminist and very forward-thinking, and that discussion of gender roles. And it was actually on Between the Covers on BBC Two. And I think it was Graham Norton on this episode who said that he didn't see how... So this novel has been very popular with young women, sort of my age, my sort of demographic. And he mentioned the whole, well, I kind of saw it as reinforcing that, and I didn't see how young women would enjoy it because it seemed like the novel was telling them to be housewives. And other people on the programme, including Jack Edwards, he said, well, actually, it's the subtleties underneath it. And I think, from that perspective, when I first watched the episode, I thought, as the others kind of skewed it, is that, Graham Norton was kind of coming at it from, almost like Graham Norton was saying, oh, well, 20-year-olds won't look deeper into this, they'll just see it on the surface. And I don't think that's where he was coming from at all, because I actually kind of agree with him. I think that I could see where he was coming from, that the novel seemed to continually reinforce, this is what you should do, this is what you should do. But I also then see that, I think in my visceral hatred of Kaji as a character, because of how annoying she is, and how irritating she is, and how I felt angry whenever she said something along the lines of, you should be, because she literally spoke like that, you should be caring for your man, because that will fulfill you. I don't understand all these women who go out and work. What are they doing? They're destroying their admirability. And it's like, girl, you have some serious problems. You have some serious insecurities. You need to work it out. Basically, I can see where he was coming from, because I think that on the surface of it, it's not very feminist. But I think there are the layers there where it is. And, it's only at the end where Dika finally accepts herself for how she is. And its meditation on weight gain is interesting, because Dika accepts herself, and there's a continual discussion on how Kaji is, she's a serial killer, which is bad, but she's demonised for her weight, and a lot of the media attention is saying how she's fat and therefore she's ugly and da-da-da, and how could people not have seen it? How did she get all these men in the first place and da-da-da? And it's talking about her cooking and etc, matronly. So I feel the book, in a way, just kind of conflict itself, and I think the underlying message is self-acceptance, but it's so kind of convoluted that you have to read underneath and between the lines, otherwise it kind of does come across a bit, if you don't indulge in food and gain weight and whatever, then you're not free, but also you're not a proper woman, but also you're not a proper feminist. And it kind of feels like if you're skinny, then you're not a feminist, in a way. But there is a little bit of that, in a sense. Not outwardly, but it could be read in that way. So, to continue on this line of thought, Kaji is described amiably, which is at odds with her as a person, but it's used in reference to her superior eating habits. You've got lines such as, true taste came with a high calorie count, and things like that. And she's very much, her philosophy is indulgence. If food is equated with romance and eroticism, food is talked about in very erotic, romantic ways. Lines like, desired as a substitute of a man, and ensured her body did not become rounded or soft. And it does kind of reinforce gender and body issues through Kaji's perspective. And the erotic sentiment behind food, it felt quite uncomfortable. And, Dika, I'll talk about this in a minute, but she has a scab at one point, and this comes a lot later in the novel, so I will talk about that a little later. But the way that it's talked about is so incredibly erotic that it felt uncomfortable. And this is alongside Dika's self-acceptance. And it just felt like you were listening to something that you shouldn't be listening to. It felt like Wattpad fanfiction. It felt really invasive. And it's interesting because, so one of the things about Dika is that she, in school, was very slender. She excelled in both class and sport. And the whole idea is that she didn't become rounded or soft, as that quote is. She said she made sure that she stayed boyish, and she was so she went to a girls' school, and she was the substitute of the men, essentially, for the other women, is how she kind of saw herself, or how she was reinforced as well, maybe as a form of self-acceptance that other people saw her as good for fulfilling that role of the boy, for the other girls' desires. And she continues and says about how she made herself boyish to make the other girls desire her. And this is very, it's reinforcing masculine stereotypes and therefore the antithesis, which is female stereotypes. And she professes self-hatred, but she still does it. She says that she thinks it's wrong, but she continues. The particular thoughts that I wrote down is she a lesbian? And she just couldn't come to terms with it. She liked the desire of the other girls, but it doesn't necessarily mean that she's gay. It might mean that actually she just liked being wanted, because ultimately who doesn't want to be wanted? And especially as an insecure teenager, you can see that layer to it, even if it's manipulative. She worried about the fact that she looks boyish, but she delves into it because she's afraid of being anything else and losing the desire of people around her. Is that why she describes Kaji like she does? If there's a particular element, and I think it's important to point out that she does talk about Kaji in very idealised terms. She talks about her almost like she loves her in a way. And she does see her as this kind of role model and idol. She follows what she does. She does what Kaji tells her to do. And while Kaji is manipulating her, she is insecure and she falls into it. And this is that reflection on the relationship between a serial killer and the public, or at least a media idealised serial killer and the public, the spectator. This whole parasocial relationship. The film industry has a lot to answer for in this way, in glamorizing killers and murder and destruction and violence. But also, this does something deep about the human condition, that we seek thrill, we seek strong emotions. Whenever we see a strong emotion, we will respond to that positively. It sets off the pleasure centers in our brain, it sets off emotion, and we strive for that, especially in this kind of perpetual cycle that is the modern world. Work, sleep, and there's a numbness to it all. You're searching for meaning, and to get excitement from anything is a change, and therefore you continue to seek it. Newspapers give serial killers these grand titles that draws people in. There are whole groups of people out there dedicated to almost worship of serial killers. They see them as idols, and they may not necessarily be killers themselves, but you get documentaries, you get films, you get biopics about killers and not about the victims. And, true crime is absolutely huge. And there is such a voyeurism to it, and humans are ultimately voyeuristic. We want to find things out and be horrified. And you can be horrified by something, but you're still partaking in the consumption of these things. And I think, true crime, there's a boundary. And I think it's important to learn about these things so we can learn from them and remember the victims. But there is a massive relationship between media journalism and glorifying killers. And this is greatly reflected in Butter. But through Dika, who is our main character, she talks about Kaji as an idol. She reflects on her. I mean, the author actually says, from Dika's perspective, that, have I been idolising her? And she does align their relationship as not a level playing field, not as a journalist and somebody they are interviewing, but as a worshipper to an idol, to a leader. Because that is kind of, Dika does everything that Kaji tells her to, in a sense. And it does, and I will give the novel this, that it does meditate on that very well, and it does it very subtly in the way that you're pulled along with it. I, as I've very openly expressed, did not like Kaji one bit. And so you can see from the outside perspective, and you can always see it from the outside. And I think it's an interesting meditation on manipulation and abuse as well. When you're on the outside, you can see it. You can see it clearly. But when you're on the inside, and I think that listening to an audiobook really added to this, because you're in that world and you're immersed in it. I believe more so than when you're actually reading it, although you can still get full immersion in that way as well. But you're listening to it and you can hear the bitterness in Kaji, and you can see the raw emotion. And, Dika always tries to manipulate her back, and she does it well in some ways. She gets to Kaji by frustrating her about beef bourguignon. And so you hear Dika being pulled along by Kaji, who is manipulative because she did it to all the men that she murdered. And from an outsider, it's very easy to say you'll be manipulated. But when you're in that, then you might not see it, and oftentimes you don't. And I think by listening to the audio, but most generally, I think the novel does that well in the way that you can see Dika's position, and you're very immersed in her emotions and her relationship with Kaji and all the things that she's going through, which compound Kaji's manipulation. But also, you can step away and you can think about it and you see it from the outside and you think, yeah, no, that is very wrong. She needs to get out. And, you know, their relationship is so... Their relationship reminds me of In Silence of the Lambs with Hannibal Lecter and Clarice. And I think obviously there's a different layer there in the fact that they're a man and a woman of different ages, whereas Kaji and Nika are both women around the similar age, which I also found interesting. I thought Kaji was going to be so much older, which is actually not. Which I think, again, adds a layer to it. You know, Kaji is not, as I expected, to be about 50. You know, different generation, different values, more traditional values. And obviously you've got to take in consideration Japanese culture as well. I'm not an expert. I don't profess being an expert. But you've got to take into consideration, you know, Western culture versus just Japanese culture and where they stand on gender roles. But I expected Kaji to be older, and she's not. And so I think that's also an important meditation on the fact that there are people of these opinions in all demographics, and there are people of more liberal opinions in all demographics. I think that's a very important point to remember. I must admit, I did find some of the talk throughout actually not very feminist. The appearances of the two characters either side of the screen, the detention centre, and the way in which they are described, a lot of characters are described initially by what they look like. They are described through particularly their body shapes, and it just felt very, I've used this word a lot, but it felt very invasive. It felt very unnecessary. You know, it makes sense. You know, as a writer myself, I understand that you want to depict a character in how they look because you want the reader to have a particular image that you also have in your mind of this character. You know, how somebody looks can be used as a descriptor for their personality, which obviously isn't always necessarily accurate in the real world sense, but there are particular tropes in the way that somebody looks and what sort of person they are. Not saying this is right, but that's how it is. And I think that the style of description, it was very in butter. It was just very, very it was very focused on what somebody looked like, but in the sense of, you know, their body weight was equated to worth. And so it did feel like it reinforced that the larger you were, the less worth you had. And it just felt very reductionist to describe a character in how they looked. And also with Kaji's own opinions being very forefronted, it then also flipped it the other way. And the fact that if you were small, if you were skinny, if you kind of conformed to that traditional beauty standard, then you had less worth. It almost became that, you know, you're trying too hard. Why are you trying so hard? And you would be spat on by Kaji because you were trying too hard to conform, which is completely inappropriate because ultimately, you know, you can't blame people for wanting to belong or, you know, body image and the ideal body is so pervasive. And so I found this demonization of skinniness, and I'm going to say skinniness and not slimness. It was very much like skinny, small, you were very much put down. And I think this is a massive issue in society as a whole, but, you know, skinny shaming as it's called, and I don't like the word skinny at all as well. I think this type of shaming isn't necessarily talked about as much because you're seen as conforming to the standard, but once you are part of the standard, it's so difficult to stay as the standard. You know, you see women who fluctuate all the time to stay in what is in vogue, and it racks the body, and it's an awful, awful way to live, and a pressure that's applied to women and to people perceived as feminine, and to people socialised as female. And I just found some of the discussion on characters when they're first brought in, it's all about what they look like. And the men too, I found it inappropriate and unnecessary. You know, you can talk about body image and the wrongs of demonising people for what they look like without focusing to the nanogram on every angle and shape on their body. You know, there's different layers to this as well. There's talk of diet culture and numbers, as I mentioned, but Dika is obsessed with Kaji. You know, at certain points she talks about her small, plump, white hands, and I just, it was so, every single time they talked about a body part in a particular way, I just hated it. And this in particular is reinforcing angelic femininity. So, you know, Dika kind of, she's confusing because I think she's almost got some internalised misogyny and internalised patriarchal thinking. So it comes out in this way. And I'd see it like that because of how she is otherwise. But I think towards the end, she doesn't even break out of this. I think to a certain point, if you've got that internalised misogyny, it's very difficult to break it. And whiteness is actually used a lot as well. I realise as I'm reading my notes, you know, it says pure white rice versus the prison food, which is more barley. It stuck in my mind particularly because it was actually that it was healthier to have these more fibre-rich grains, and that was what was available in the prison, and the idea of like the societal link and the culture link to white rice. And yeah, there was this idea of whiteness as well, which wasn't focused on as much. Again, I think a load of things are trying to be packed in this novel. But I thought that was an interesting meditation, especially from the Japanese perspective. And I kind of want to hear a little bit more about that, not necessarily in this novel, just generally. But what's seen as good and bad over time warps, right? And this woman, Kaji, is so obsessed with butter that she says that people who can't tell the difference between butter and margarine are unbearable. And genuinely, please shut up. She is unbearable. She is unbearable. It's interesting because the murderer, Kaji, is very anti-diet, but she's very specific in the sorts of men that she wants: affluent, respectable. She wants a full-bodied woman, and then she demonizes people for being skinny. The journalist friend Dekor is very nice. She says that she isn't different, that Dika doesn't look any different. She hasn't put on weight like people are telling her. There's a particular section where Dika's being told, "Oh my God, you're gaining weight, you're gaining weight." And actually, there's a bit where she looks at herself and Dekor talks to her and actually says, like, "Well, you haven't really." And it's because Dika originally conformed to that skinny standard, to put it that way, that she'd been perceived as gaining weight, but she actually really hadn't. And again, there's this idea of being perceived in that, other people are always going to have those opinions, but it is what you feel comfortable in, and ultimately it's none of their business. And I think the friends relationship was actually really nice in that way, to highlight that. And I do think they have actually a really nice relationship, and I think that was one of the highlights of the book, I think. I just thought that was nice to see in a novel that otherwise was quite, with all the references to food and weight. But Deko also points out that Dika almost says that she wants to be like Kaji, like the killer. Maybe it's that power, since she's insecure in a rocky relationship, and so having that kind of freedom of thought that Kaji has, and she's very militant and very forceful in the way that she has her own opinions, and that's good. And also, she's so like anti-feminist, but then she's very, well, I'm great, and people listen to me, and da-da-da-da. And it's like, well, without feminism, nobody will be listening to you. So it's interesting how she's very contradicting, and she's very hypocritical, so... Yeah, I mean, Dika's boyfriend apologises about bashing her weight because he said that she's doing it to get a scoop. And this is that kind of idea of when, to be very stereotypical, and I'm sorry, but when a man thinks he's a feminist, but he's not a feminist, he doesn't understand. It's the idea of like, in any case, you're coming from outside of the minority group. And so if you're coming from outside of that group, you don't know what it's like to be suppressed in that way. There's different layers to this, different groups. It's quite interesting, but also obviously not all men are like this. Not all men are like this, so I'm going to repeat it. But it was just so, like, it's one of those groan moments. You're like, no, oh my God. But yeah, Kaji is completely using her. And yeah, Kaji is such a hypocrite. She has all these love affairs, and yet has all children, marriage. She's completely deluded. Yeah, it's kind of unnerving. So flipping back again, sorry, all my notes are in they're in this chronological order, so they're just in the order in which I mentioned them, so I'll be skipping around themes a little bit. But I mentioned a little bit earlier that in its discussion of food, it's rather over-sexual. The pleasure of food is compared to the pleasure of sex and relationships. And Dika finds safety and comfort in food and in dreaming because of her unsteady relationship and the people who put it down. Thinking of others when your relationship is going down, or uncertainty. And talking about the food stuff, I think the biggest trigger has to be for comfort or binge eating. And I think that is almost a glamorization of binge eating within it as well. And again, translations, the style of translation and the version of translation is massively impactful for this. But obviously the source material has to have this sentiment, and I think that it does glamorize binge eating a bit. But again, talking about this desire question and the over-sexualization of food, there's an interesting meditation on female desire. Is it wrong or not? And it isn't wrong. I think Kaji, in a way, is, again, this kind of, she's anti-feminist, but she's also kind of actually a feminist because she's very female desire is good. And Dika feels awkward asking her boyfriend for sex, and the idea of the openness of society and the embarrassment within a relationship. As someone who identifies as a woman, I think that female desire, or even my own personal desire, you do feel embarrassed even within a relationship to be open about these things because you're not supposed to be. It's the man who initiates, right? And this makes you very uncertain, and then if somebody, if your partner then thinks that you're holding back because you don't like them, it all becomes very convoluted in a world where women are not supposed to show desire because they are mothers, they are childbearers, and therefore it's inappropriate. I do like, in the end, Dika finally combats the murderess. I don't think we're supposed to like her, and the change to first person, focusing more on the case, is really nice. I think, overall, the case is secondary, and this isn't an issue, but I do not think we get into it enough. I wanted a little more case and a little less dwelling on how they looked. I like Dika's growth, her swelling self-acceptance and freedom, and also the exploration of Kaji's character was also really interesting. But when I was getting into the nitty-gritty of the case, it flips the body image again. And there's a cooking class later on as well, and it's all female power. Oh, look at the case. Are you getting interested? Let's do some cooking. And it's a bit, what? And I've actually written here, like, breaking barriers don't have to be fully one way or the other. You know, the idea of, like, so I can cook and also investigate this case, question mark, I don't know. I do wonder whether I'm trying too hard to read things into it. Going back to kind of Graham Norton sentiment and whatever, I think that, you know, am I reading into it and reading between the lines? And I always do this anyway, you know, I love a subtle theme. As I said, subtlety. But does it get to a point where I'm a bit like English literature analysis A-level? Are you trying too hard to read things into it? Because the cooking class, I get it. You know, in the blurb on the RCW Lit Agency, you know, it said, oh, well, you know, the cooking class and Kaji was in this cooking class and it was her vehicle to finding the men and killing them. And I'm thinking, yeah, but the cooking class is only mentioned, like, right at the end. I hear nothing about a cooking class until right at the end. It's not even mentioned. It's like in a Sherlock Holmes novel, and the murderer pops up right in the last, say it's like 8 chapters long, and the person who's done the murder pops up in chapter 6, and you're like, well, you know, like, there's no full worn narrative. And I found the cooking class just kind of popped out of nowhere, and Dika goes there and gets involved in the cooking class, and she talks to people who are in the cooking class, which encourages the case forward. And so I'm listening to it thinking, oh, finally, we're getting more into the case, and, like, it's a bit late, but, you know, I'll go with it. And then it goes off kilter again. And starts talking about Dika's relationships and Kaji's relationships with men and food again, and I'm thinking, oh my god, please no. I just thought the idea of the cooking class, like, I wish that had come in earlier, and I wish we ditched some of the body image stuff, because I think it was 2 novels shoved into one. I think the author perhaps was trying to say too many things, and I think it should have been a novel about the relationship with the serial killer, or the serial killer's case, or even, you know, the relationship of a woman with her body and her friends and her family, or the case. I think, you know, I'm not saying that they have to be exclusive. I found the relationship between, as I've said, Kaji and Dika very interesting, but I think that it just didn't talk about the case enough, and having something pop up right at the end was a bit lazy almost in narrative planning and plot planning. But I found it a bit ridiculous in the way that it took Dika falling into the road, which is a scab thing that I mentioned earlier, to realise, it's like, Kaji is a brutal murderer. And I'm like, yeah, no way, Sherlock. It's like, of course she is. And again, from the outside perspective, as I talked about before, you know, if you're in the cycle of abuse or manipulation, you can't see it. But even then, by then, Dika had kind of come to realise this, and it dawned on her fully and everything. And I just found it a bit, like, almost unbelievable that it took her so long to kind of finally admit it to herself. But again, I can see that, you know, manipulation, everything, very insecure. But one of the things that really, you know, it's all the talk of food. And I'm very kind of, you know, I don't like eating noises, and it's all very, you know, somebody's eating on camera, I don't like it. There's a section where the whole eating scabs thing, okay? So a little boy comes over and she's helped up by a mother, because she's just fallen, helped up by a mother, just fallen in the road, etc., etc. And the little boy's like, oh, I love scabs, I like eating, he whispers in her ear, I like eating scabs. From a little boy, I get it. I was a bit like, bit odd, bit of an odd thing to mention, but sure. Later on, a bit of a scab falls off, and she's in her flat, whatever, and she licks it. And then it talks about the blood trailing down her leg, and the language is so succulent and, again, erotic. And I hate it. I deeply despise. And it's just like, why? That doesn't, it makes no sense. Why? I get the whole idea of, like, the kind of, like, desire for pain, maybe. The whole idea of, like, how her relationship with food had been warped by Kaji, and the physical pain kind of links in the way of, like, maybe everything can be desired like food, or maybe everything can be tasted and experienced. Honestly, I feel like I'm trying too hard right now. I just found it really weird. And maybe I'm missing something. I don't know. But after going through all of my notes on my notes app, which I've just completed, oh my god, I'm going to just quickly talk about because I realised that this has actually been quite long. This is longer than I expected this episode to be, actually. So wow, look at me, feature length. But the whole Waterstones Book of the Year of it all. So I think that how this novel as a whole and the themes it deals with are very important. And I found, as I've expressed throughout, so I'm not going to repeat myself, but some elements of it really intriguing and well done. But I also thought there was a lot wanting. I thought storycraft was wanting in a way. I think that it needed refining. I think stuff needed cutting. I think things could have been developed better. I thought the characters were good. I thought the relationships were good. But I wanted less dwelling. It dwelled a lot in particular themes, and some of the themes were popped up and then discarded, and I think it was unnecessary and it just needed streamlining. Translation adds a lot to it, of course, adds another layer. And ultimately, these are all my opinions. You know, if you pick it up and read it and like it, that's fine. I'm not one to enforce my opinion on other people. But one thing I will say about the whole book prize thing, earning an award for your book is amazing, and it's a massive thing as an author. It can really kickstart your career, and anything like that. And this, for me personally, comes more down to the storycraft and the style of the writing rather than the actual contents of the story itself. So, plot, are things structured well, and the actual lyricism of the writing. I love lyrical, poetic writing. And as I mentioned briefly, some of the sentences were a bit da-donk, they're a bit clunky. And again, this can be the translation, so it's not necessarily the author's, the author doesn't have full command on that because it is the work of the translator. But I found some of it a bit clunky, and so I just thought I'd argue whether I was not shocked, but a bit, oh, this is Waterstones Book of the Year? Really? I know that's my own opinion. I wouldn't, if I picked it up and read it, I wouldn't, if I didn't know that it was Waterstones Book of the Year, if I didn't know that it had won prizes, I wouldn't think that it had won prizes. And like I say, I get from a thematic point of view why it has won prizes. I think the actual idea for the story is really interesting. I just think it could have been done slightly better. And yeah, I just think it could have been cut down. And it would have made it a much more streamlined and nicer story and nicer meditation on these themes. I thought bits of it were really well written. Some bits of it were less well written. But again, that could be the translation. And the whole, you don't have to take prizes as being, these are the best things, and therefore that's what I'm going to read. They're used as guidelines by a lot of people, I think. But sometimes prizes and popularities of books actually puts me off. I don't know why, it just does. But yeah, I guess basically what I'm trying to get at is I don't think that this, me personally, I think there are other books that are better, and this being Waterstones Book of the Year, I think is quite a stretch. I wouldn't necessarily think this is better than anything else. But that's my own personal opinion. I'm not a judge, and other people may thoroughly enjoy it and see other things in it that I don't, and that's okay. That's what reading's all about, that's what book reviews are all about, that's what talking and discussing themes is all about, and I think this book is good in the way that it raises a lot of themes to be discussed. It'd be a great book club pick, which I assume is why Between the Covers chose it. And, you're allowed to dislike something. I wouldn't recommend this book to anyone for an enjoyment perspective, but I would be interested in talking to other people who've read it to discuss the themes of it. And the whole concept of literary prizes as well, I think there's probably slight bitterness in me as well. Just in the actual flow of the writing, I'm just talking about writing flow, I'm not talking about craft or publicising or marketing or any of the other things that go along with publishing a book. When I talk about flow of the writing style, I'm like, God, I could write better than this. Why don't I have the prize? Give it to me. But obviously there are a lot of layers to that, and that's just me on a very surface level. I respect the author greatly, the translators, everyone who went into getting this book on the shelves, because it's so difficult. And props to her, props to the author, because she has created something that got her out there. And I think she has things to say. I think they could be said better. But that's my opinion of Butter. And it's been a long episode, and I think there's some interesting themes for discussion. If you've read Butter, please let me know. I would love to discuss it. My one true desire in life is to be part of a book club, because I just love chatting about these things. They're big topics that you can really get your teeth into. Little side note, this is another audio episode. I think it's going to be all audio episodes up until Christmas, and hopefully some more written pieces. I just need to knuckle down and actually write them, so that's fine. But yeah, thank you all so much for listening. Please let me know what you think, whether you like these book club kind of episodes. I think they're great springboards for particular topics and discussion. And thank you all so much for listening. I hope to see you soon. Take care, and let's keep talking.